Hey everyone, welcome to another Deck Tech. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into Temur Hooting Delver, or just Temur Delver. So just like previous Deck Techs, in this case we've only had one previous Deck Tech, we're going to be going through, the creatures, instants, sorceries, lands, so on and so forth of this deck. We're going to take a brief overview of the sideboard, and we're going to explain for each card why we play it and how we use it in the deck in different scenarios. So let's get right to it. Let's start off with creatures, a very interesting and important part of this deck. Starting off with Delver of Secrets, the namesake, Temur Hooting Delver. I think we've all been introduced to Delver in different ways, whether you're playing it in Modern, Legacy, and even Vintage at times. Delver's Secrets is a great card. It dies to basically any form of removal, but you would be shocked at how many games a flip Delver, takes your opponent down to sub 10 life really quickly. The deck is built around protecting your threats, and that includes Delver. Modern has very few instances of creatures that have flying or reach, so you're often just flying over your opponent's creatures. That's all relevant, and it's essentially a lightning bolt each turn with just one flip Delver on the field. If you have a Delver in opening hand, 99% of the time you're going to start off by playing Delver and passing off to your opponent, and with 28 instants and sorceries in the main board, you have a very, very good chance of having Delver flip. I've had plenty of, I wouldn't say I've had plenty of games, but I've had games where, I've gone 3, 4, 5 turns and Delver hasn't flipped, and they're extremely infuriating, but they're also extremely rare. Oftentimes, Delver will flip the turn after it comes down, or 2 turns after. So, Delver of Secrets, great card, not a flex spot. You got to keep it in the deck. There aren't really any matchups where you would remove Delver. It's just an efficient beater. Up next is Hooting Mandrills, the second namesake of this deck. I would say that Hooting Mandrills really makes Temur Delver the tempo deck that it is in Modern. Hooting Mandrills is just a common from cons, and a lot of people probably overlook it, but it has Delve. You can cast it for essentially 1 green, for 1 green mana and 5 cards from your graveyard, and all we do in this deck is interact with our opponent, so our graveyard is always ripe with exile choices for us to delve with, and Hooting Mandrills is just a game winner in and of itself. Not looking at Tarmogoyf. Hooting Mandrills is a 4/4 body with trample. Oftentimes your opponents will forget that trample is a thing on Hooting Mandrills, and it makes combat math a little bit more complicated for your opponents as well. And that trample really, really makes a difference. Tarmogoyf can get really big, really fast, especially with our deck, but at the end of the day, it can get chumped by 1/1 tokens for eternity. Hooting Mandrills, you need to multi-block with small creatures if you really want to kill it, or if you really want to prevent all of the damage it can deal, and it's just an annoying creature for your opponents to deal with. Not to mention it's hard to kill. It's hard to remove with the removal suite that Modern has. Inquisition of Kozilek can't strip it from your hand. So Hooting Mandrills really pulls its weight. Really, probably an extremely overlooked card. But if you're playing Temur Delver in Modern, you're almost certainly playing at least 2 Hooting Mandrills in your deck. I always play 4. It's really not a card I'm willing to play around with in terms of how many I have in the 75. Moving on, Tarmogoyf. I can't say enough about Tarmogoyf, and if you've watched any of my previous videos or last Deck Tech, Tarmogoyf is one of my most favorite creatures in Modern, if not my favorite, next to Huntmaster of the Fells. And again, this deck is really not this deck without Tarmogoyf. And I think looking at the first 3 cards in this deck tech, and analyzing what each of those creatures does, I mean, they're all 4-ofs, and I've basically just told you that they're all mandatory for this deck, and it's really true. I mean, I have 14 creatures, but Windcaller Raven is not really considered a threat here. It's mostly used for cycling and combat tricks. So we have 12 threats in the deck. That's essentially how you should think about it. In your main board, in the main 60, you have 12 threats. And that number can vary. It could go up a bit if you swap Windcaller Raven for something else, Snapcaster or some other threat. But generally speaking, the core of your deck are those 3 creatures. You play 4 of each, and that's that. So very, very important part of Temur Delver. It's something you really can't overlook, and it's a part of the deck where there's very little wiggle room, at least in my opinion. I don't think I need to go any deeper into Tarmogoyf, do I? We have Seal of Fire, Tar Fire. There are variants of this deck that play with Mishra's Bauble. There are many ways this Tarmogoyf gets big quickly, which is important also for Stubborn Denial, which we'll get to later. So keep good old Tarmogoyf. Up next in the creature slot is Windcaller Raven. I currently play 2. Obviously, I have no intentions of ever casting Windcaller Raven for its mana cost. I'm always cycling Windcaller Raven. And ideally, I'm cycling Windcaller Raven to draw a card and to throw either Tarmogoyf or Hooting Mandrills up into the air so that we can get over our opponent's creatures and potentially kill our opponent. Windcaller Raven is a card our opponents don't really think about. They can't necessarily prepare for very easily, and it's just a blowout. I mean, imagine having a 6/7 Tarmogoyf staring down a field of tokens, and all of a sudden you give it flying until end of turn. That's super powerful. And it's, I'm running 2 Windcaller Ravens, I'm running 1 Simic Charm. If I were to remove one or both Windcaller Ravens, I'd probably goose my Simic Charm count a bit, because combat tricks have a good place here in this deck. So yeah, don't underestimate Windcaller Raven. You don't always have to cast it as a combat trick. I've done it plenty of times at the end of my opponent's turn, just because we desperately need to draw a card or we really want to find an answer. So it has some flexibility in how it's used, and I found it to be relatively useful. I can't think of another card I'd want to put in its place. An honorable mention, and I'm not going to show him on the screen, but Snapcaster Mage. Many variants of Temur Delver in Modern play 1 or more Snapcaster Mages. I've never been a fan of Snapcaster Mage in this build, of course. I don't mean Snapcaster Mage in general. It's just not necessarily something we need to be doing or want to be doing. We have plenty of redundancy in our spells that bringing one back is not necessarily extremely powerful in this deck. So Snapcaster is really your call. If you enjoy playing with Snapcaster Mage, then you can swap out 1 or both Windcaller Ravens for 1 or 2 Snapcaster Mages, but it's not necessarily something I would recommend at this point in time. So that's it for creatures. Let's move on to instants. Now, instants and sorceries are where you can play a bit more with their composition. The composition I'm going to show you now is one that I've played for a while. I'm very comfortable with. Irrespective of what the current meta is, I really enjoy this comp. That being said, as I go through each card, I'll bring up the flexibility that you have with certain cards and what other cards you could bring in instead. Starting with Force of Negation. I love this card. I'm so happy it was printed. When I first played Temur Delver many years ago in Modern, I have Force of Negation Disrupting Shoal, and I really enjoyed Disrupting Shoal. But Force of Negation is just so much better. Unlike Disrupting Shoal, Force of Negation only hits non-creature spells, and you can only cast it for its alternate cost on your opponent's turn. Those are two important restrictions, probably restrictions that were necessary, or else the card would be just busted. Nevertheless, this card helps you take out Planeswalkers on your opponent's turn when you're tapped out, helps you take out removal when you're tapped out. It's endless, the use cases for Force of Negation. I think 3 is good, 4 is a bit too much, but 3 is a good number. You could run less if you really want to, or you could run none. So if you remove Force of Negation, you really don't like the aspect of, 2-for-1ing yourself essentially, then you can up your other spells. For example, you can play a combination of Spell Pierce, Spell Snare. You could bring your Mana Leak count to 4. I play 3 right now, but you could bring that up to 4. Or you could do different compositions altogether. You can omit permission replacements for Force of Negation and just, up your Thought Scour count. Or, go for 2 more Traverse the Elven Wald in your sorceries. You have some room to play if you choose to opt out of Force of Negation. That being said, give it a shot. It's really awesome. I have a lot of gameplay where Force of Negation makes our opponents rage quit because it's just powerful. It just stops cards you don't want to resolve, and you don't have to worry about tapping out. And that's a powerful play in this deck. This deck is all about tempo. And when you tap out and something happens when you're tapped out and you can't stop it, that can potentially, hit the tempo gains you've made up to that point. Force of Negation ensures that you don't lose that tempo or that tempo advantage. Up next, Lightning Bolt. I feel like skipping this card. I don't really think I need to explain why Lightning Bolt is here. I don't need to explain why we play 4 of it. It's just efficient removal, efficient damage. Keep it. You never really side it out except for decks that have little to no creatures. That's end of story. Mana Leak is another flex spot in terms of permission, although I would not recommend completely removing Mana Leak unless you are working on some other interesting variant of Temur Delver. I have played variants in the past where in the place of Mana Leak I'm playing Deprive. Deprive is 2 blue, and you can cast it with an alternate cost of... when you do cast it, you have to return an island to your hand. And that's powerful because it counters the spell that you're targeting, any kind of spell, but you're also losing a land. So you're going back in terms of land drops, which is problematic. I did enjoy playing with Deprive, but in the current meta, the way decks are currently are, especially with Ponza running around, pillaging your lands turn 2, it's not necessarily something you want to do. So, Mana Leak is great. It's great early game. It targets creatures, which most, if not all, of your other permissions in this deck cannot target. And yeah, it's definitely something you want in the deck. There are plenty of plays where turn 1 you have a Delver, and turn 2 you could play Tarmogoyf, or you could Serum Visions, but instead you just keep 2 mana up and a Mana Leak because you want to counter whatever your opponent is going to play next, whether it's their second or third turn. Leaking a big spell on their second or third turn could be a huge swing in your favor. So don't underestimate Mana Leak's limitations. Next up is Opt. Again, another flex spot. It really depends on what you're doing with your instants and sorceries. I run 2. It's fine. I almost exclusively use it at the end of my opponent's turn. There have been times where I cast it when I need to dig for some sort of answer, and I have at times found that answer with Opt. Of course, some of that is luck, but hey, that's why Opt is there. It allows you to dig and potentially find an answer right away. It could be cast at instant speed. Some people play more, some people don't play any. I think 2 is a good number for the current list that I'm playing. Up next is Simic Charm. People kind of laugh at Simic Charm for some reason. People think that Izzet Charm more or less is the only charm you should be playing in Modern, or that is playable in Modern. That's just not true. Simic Charm has its uses. When I do draw it, it's almost never a dead draw. Worst case, it's something you sacrifice to Force of Negation, but that's not why it's there. The ability to give a creature hexproof, the ability to return a permanent to its opponent, to its owner's hand, the ability to give a creature +3/+3. Those are very, very powerful in this deck. It could save your creature from removal. It could help you trick your opponent into double blocking a Tarmogoyf, let's say, or a Hooting Mandrills, thinking they're going to kill it, but then you give them +3/+3, and all of a sudden they survive combat, and your opponent loses all their creatures, and then takes trample damage, in the case of Hooting Mandrills. Simic Charm is powerful. The only reason I'm honestly only running one of is because of Windcaller Raven, because Windcaller Raven also allows me to do some combat tricks. But realistically, I could go down to one Windcaller Raven and go up to 2 Simic Charm. I would never play 3 Simic Charm. 3 is a bit much, given the fact that it's 2 mana. So we don't want to stock up too much on our 2 mana spells. But 1 or 2 in your deck, try it out. I think you're going to enjoy it. Up next, one of my favorite permissions in Magic, if not my current favorite, Stubborn Denial. I don't know what I can tell you. A Stubborn Denial with Ferocious active is just a really good feeling. Whether you're casting it or not, just having it in your hand and knowing you can cast it at any time to stop essentially any non-creature spell is extremely powerful. Your opponents don't often see it coming, because not many decks play Stubborn Denial. Some of them can't, because they can't reliably get 4+ power creatures. That being said, we can, and Stubborn Denial is super powerful. It's basically negate for 1 mana when you have 4/5 Tarmogoyf or 4/4 Hooting Mandrills on the field. So, or Flipped Huntmaster of the Fells. So, yeah, Stubborn Denial, really, really good. I would not run less than 4, in my opinion. If you are going to run less than 4, replace one of them with a Spell Pierce, or potentially Spell Snare. That would be my recommendation. Next up is Tarfire. I run 2 of. I think 2 is good. 1 is not enough. 3 might be too many. 2 is a good number. Mostly there to grow Tarmogoyf, but it is another source of creature removal. Worst case, it goes to your opponent's face. So, and it feeds Delirium, as a bonus for Traverse the Elvenwald. So, a pretty important card, actually. I would keep it. And again, the only time we're removing it inside is sideboarded games where you don't have many creature targets. Last but not least, this is something... So last but not least is Thought Scour, and this is something that I stray away from many Temur Delver players. I only play 2 Thought Scour. Most play 3 to 4. Rarely have I seen people playing less than 3. I find that we have enough interaction in this deck to warrant just 2 Thought Scour. I don't really have issues casting Hooting Mandrills, which is the main reason why we run through Thought Scour. It's not necessarily to grow Tarmogoyf. It's to allow us to accelerate into Hooting Mandrills. It's not really the game plan that I'm running here. I'm not really running a turn 2 Hooting Mandrills play, although it could happen, and it has happened when you have both in hand. But I don't think I need that to win games, at least in this composition. So I only have 2 Thought Scours, but again, you could play more, especially if you're not playing Force of Negation. You have a bit of room to play more of other cards. Thought Scour is a potential candidate to bump up to 3 or 4 of. Alright, so that's it for instance. Let's go to Sorceries. I'm only running 7 right now. We'll start off with Flame Slash. It's a 1-of. I don't like 1-ofs, but the fact that we have so much removal, I don't really consider it a 1-of. I consider it just part of the removal package. It deals 4 damage at sorcery speed. This is target Glorybringer or anyone else, anything else that's in the 4 toughness range. It's a useful card. Again, I keep it in there unless we're playing again, decks that don't really have creature targets, especially in decks that don't have creature targets, because Flame Slash, unlike our other removal, can only target creatures. So, something to keep in mind. Serum Visions, 4 of. Again, another card I don't think I need to explain too much about. We all know what Serum Visions does. Draw a card, scry 2. Very powerful. It's a must-have. A must-have 4 of. That's it. Moving on. Two times Traverse the Elvenwald. So Traverse the Elvenwald, again, a lot of Temur Delver players play 4 of. I run 2. I think, again, in the composition that I'm currently playing, 2 is more than enough. If you feel that you need to remove Force of Negation and Simic Charm, and you just don't want to play with those cards, and you want to see what other cards you can boost up, apart from Thought Scour being a target, or Mana Leak, Traverse the Elvenwald could also be a target. But generally speaking, if you're going to be going 4 of Traverse the Elvenwalds, you also want to be playing Mishra's Bauble, which I don't play. So it takes a bit more tweaking to your deck to make that work. But it is doable. I run 2 of. I think it's good enough. It allows you to get lands early on if you're short on mana. Mid to late game, it allows you to tutor essentially Tarmogoyf, or potentially Huntmaster of the Fells. You're not really going to tutor Hooting Mandrills, but Tarmogoyf, Huntmaster of the Fells, those are usually targets for Traverse when Delirium is active. So, great card. So we have 1 enchantment in here, Seal of Fire. I think you can guess at this point why we have one. It's an enchantment and allows us to make our Tarmogoyfs bigger. And again, it's part of the removal package. So 1 of is okay, it's acceptable. We don't need to draw Seal of Fire every game. So I'm fine with having a 1 of. And it gives you an option. It's Seal of Fire. You can cast turn 1 or turn 2 and just wait, and you could pop it whenever necessary. And it can make your opponents apprehensive about attacking in, because they know at any instant you could potentially make your Tarmogoyf much bigger and also weaken their creatures. Moving on to lands. So we run 17 lands, and this really varies from one build to another. Some people run 16 lands. Those are usually the builds that run 4 Traverse and 4 Mishra's Baubles. Other builds run 18 lands. You really don't want to go below 16. You really don't want to go above 18. 16 to 18 is usually the range. I find with my build, 17 is just right. You don't want to flood out every game. It's really bad for this deck. It's really, really bad. You definitely don't want to go short either. And I find 17 is a good balance between the two. So keep that in mind. 1 time Breeding Pool, 2 times Steam Vents, 1 time Stomping Ground. Yeah, I mean, you need them. Steam Vents is a bit more important than Breeding Pool and Stomping Ground, because, well, red is your removal and blue is your Delver / ability to dig for more cards. If you already have green, you're fine, but Steam Vents is a bit more important, which is why we run 2 of. The rest are fetches and basics. So I run 2 islands, 1 forest. I think that's fine. Some of you might want to be a bit more risky and run 1 island, 1 forest, and maybe run an extra fetch. That could work. I don't recommend it. First of all, you want basic targets for Path to Exile. You want basic targets for Traverse early game. So you want some amount of basics in your deck. And yeah, you don't want too many fetches either. Because you start getting to a point where we have so many fetches and not enough targets for them. So you got to be careful there. And yeah, 4 Misty Rainforest, 4 Scalding Tarn, 2 Wooded Foothills. And Wooded Foothills could be played around with. I guess you could have 1 or 2 depending on what other lands you're playing. But 4 Misties, 4 Scalding Tarns is a must. So we're not really dealing with budget here. You need to have 4 of each. And that's really our land comp. We start plenty of games with just 1 land in hand. Some games you have 2, some games you have 3. Starting hands of 4 lands or more are usually mulligans, unless the other 3 cards are really, really powerful, or they're silver bullets that you need to beat your opponent with. So just keep that in mind. And that's it for the main 60. So as usual, I'm going to power through the sideboard, only because, again, metas change often. Your local meta will be different than mine. The online meta is different than the paper meta. So, most of these slots are flex slots in the sideboard. That being said, let's go through them. Ancient Grudge, artifact removal, and you can cast it once from your graveyard as well. So you could cast it twice potentially. You need it. You need some form of artifact removal, and I find Ancient Grudge is still very useful in that sense. So yeah, Ancient Grudge, but you do have other options in Modern for 2 mana to remove artifacts. Next up is 3 Blood Moon, and this is something I don't consider a flex spot in the sideboard. You definitely want to be running 3 Blood Moon, minimum 2, but I don't find 2 is enough. Generally speaking, when you're bringing Blood Moon against a deck, that means you really need Blood Moon. So 2 is usually not enough. You want 3. 4 is too much, I find, because even with 3, it happens often where I'm drawing into 2 of them. But I think 2 is not enough unless you have some other moon-like effect, or you're playing Dampening Sphere, which I don't enjoy in this build, but some people do play it. So yeah, 3 Blood Moon, that's a less negotiable spot. Up next is Destructive Revelry. I like Destructive Revelry. And remember, we have Cindervines, which is an enchantment that allows you to remove an artifact and enchantment. Functionally, I prefer Cindervines, but the only reason I don't run it is because of Delver. So we still need to maintain some good balance of instants and sorceries in the deck, even in the sideboarded games. Destructive Revelry is an instant, so that's my main reasoning for why I keep it. And it hits enchantments, and nothing else in our 75 hits enchantments, really, except for Engineered Explosives. Speaking of which, we have a 1x of Engineered Explosives. This is a flexible spot in your sideboard. You can play 2 if you really want. You can play none. I find 1 right now is fine, but yeah, I mean, you can play around with this. This is mostly for sweeping tokens, or for creatures that are, that have similar mana costs, and decks that go wide with them. It could be merfolk, it could be goblins, whatever it may be. Even prowess decks where a lot of their creatures are 1 or 2 mana. Engineered Explosives can be pretty powerful there. It could also remove other types of permanents that you don't want and that you need to deal with. Artifacts like Chalice or enchantments. Feed the Clan. I play 1, many play 2 or 3. It really depends on what your other cards are. I have 2 Huntmaster of the Fells, which is why I only really play 1 Feed the Clan. Most of the time, Ferocious is going to be active when you're playing it, so 10 mana is pretty significant for 10 life is pretty significant for 2 mana. So Feed the Clan, pretty good. Again, it depends on your play style and your local meta. So if you're not playing burn heavy or super aggro heavy metas locally, then maybe you don't necessarily need too many Feed the Clans. Up next, Goblin Crater Maker. I have it here. This is a card I'm still trying out. I like it. You can choose to have it deal 2 damage to target creature when you sacrifice it. Realistically, it's there for its second ability, or its second option, which is destroy target colorless non-land permanent. You're bringing this in against artifact decks. You're bringing this in against Tron decks. The ability to target their colorless planeswalkers or their colorless creatures, whatever it may be. It's actually pretty powerful for 3 mana, essentially. So that's why I'm playing a 1 of. Again, you could play around. You could play other cards in this place, but I like it. I like it so far. Up next, Grafdigger's Cage. Again, I play 2 of. Some play 3. Some play none, but I wouldn't recommend it. The only reason I'm only playing 2 of is because I also play Klothys, and Klothys also allows us to interact with our opponent's graveyard and, pick and choose what cards go. But if you're not a Klothys fan, then move Grafdigger's Cage up to 3 if you're dealing a lot with Dredge and other graveyard-centric decks. Moving on to Huntmaster of the Fells. Man, if I could play 8 of these cards, I would. I really love Huntmaster of the Fells. Top 3 creatures of Magic that I really enjoy playing with. it really finishes out games fast. A lot of people don't see it, but it really, really does. Sometimes it does eat removal, and that's true, but I still see that as a win. Because generally speaking, that means that removal is not going towards your other creatures that are just as efficient as killing your opponent. That being said, if Huntmaster of the Fells is left unchecked, or if you are able to defend it because you have Force of Negation or other counter spells, it will end games extremely quickly. Opponents change the way they play. That's if they know how powerful Huntmaster of the Fells is. If they don't, then they're definitely going to lose. But if they do, then that does alter the way they think about their turns. Do they really want to cast a spell? How many spells can they cast? What happens if he flips to one side or the other? Just coming into the battlefield, you gain 2 life and get a 2/2 token. That's pretty important. The minute it flips, which you can do either during at the end of your opponent's turn if they don't cast anything, or the following turn when it's your turn to play and choose not to cast anything. When it flips to become a Ravager of the Fells and deals 2 damage to your opponent and 2 damage to any up to 1 creature that they control. Again, that's a super powerful play. You now have a 4/4 Trampler, and generally speaking, I don't even attack in with it unless I need to. I just wait for my opponent's turn or my next turn. I cast 2 spells and I have it flip back, and then I just keep playing that flipping game back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and before you know it, in 2 turns, 3 turns, your opponent's gone, and it helped really seal the deal. So I really enjoy Huntmaster of the Fells. I bring it in against most decks, most grindy decks. The only time I'm not bringing Huntmaster of the Fells is if we're playing against super explosive decks, or combo decks. That's where you don't really want Huntmaster of the Fells. Up next, Klothys. Again, this is really only there to attack graveyard strategies. Really only coming in against Dredge. I may sometimes bring it in against extremely grindy matchups, but it's mostly there for Dredge or in matchups where I feel I need Klothys to help me, win out in a board stall. So yeah, Klothys can come in handy. Not as often as I would like it to, but I still believe it has a place in my sideboard. Last but not least, Veil of Summer. I mean, very powerful card. You bring it against Jund, most black decks, most blue decks. Helps you protect your creatures, helps you draw a card, helps your spells from being countered. It does everything you want for 1 green mana at instant speed. So, I play 2 of. I think 2 of is good. Some people play 3. You don't want to play 1. It's not enough. Again, in my composition, I find 2 is good. Depending on your meta, you might want to play more of them. But yeah, 2 of Veil of Summer. Really great card. And that does it for the main 75. Now, that being said, there's one other card I want to discuss that's not in this deck. And that's the Companion Jegantha. So, Jegantha is part of the Companion craze. You could slot it into this deck if you get rid of Force of Negation and if you get rid of Windcaller Aven. Those are the only 2 cards that do not comply with the Companion restriction. I think with the proper modifications, Jegantha does have a place here. I mean, listen, it's an extra 5/5 beater. If games really go long and drag out and you need something to give you an edge. That's really it. Its ability of adding 5 mana, 1 of each color, it's not really something you're going to be using. It's really there for attacking, going in sideways. So you can play it. The only reason I don't currently play it is because I'm a contrarian, and if everyone is doing something, I try and find something that does the opposite. I'm comfortable with the way my deck currently is without Jegantha. That being said, if companions stick around and Wizards decides that they're just fine in Modern the way they are, I will start looking at making modifications to my deck to incorporate Jegantha. So keep that in mind. I wanted to bring it up. I didn't bring it up with my Temur Tarmodrazi deck, but it slots in there perfectly. I mean, I would do it immediately because I don't have to do much to the deck to make it work. I just need to remove a couple of optional sideboard cards. But in my build of Temur Hooting Delver, there's a bit more modifications to the deck. It's a bit more involved. It does change my playstyle a bit, and I don't like that at the moment. I like my Force of Negations, and I like my Windcaller Raven, although Windcaller Raven is really more optional than anything else. But I do like my Force of Negations. That's really my main holdout, and because I'm not sure where Companion is going. So, yeah. So I just wanted to make that an honorable mention. Gigantha definitely has a place in Temur Delver in Modern, but I'm currently holding my breath. So that's it. That's the in-depth deck tech for Temur Hooting Delver. I hope you enjoyed it. I really love this deck. This is the deck that makes me keep coming back to Magic. This is the deck that keeps me in Modern. You know, all the other Temur builds, all the other Temur decks that I play, or red-green decks, or green-blue decks that I play, they're only side distractions to this deck. This is the deck I love. This is the deck that I own, you know, fully foiled and blinged out version of in paper, that my wife doesn't know about, so don't tell anyone. You know, so this is the deck I really, really love. I've put in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of games with it over the years, and I don't really see myself stopping. It's very infuriating to play this deck. It does require concentration. It does require a good knowledge of most of the decks in the meta. It does require that you manage your resources carefully, and you will find yourself many times kinking yourself in the butt because of one move you did in the previous turn that seemed good, that is good, but it wasn't the right good move. There was another move that was better, and you would have won the game if you did that move. But I feel that it also forces you to become a better player, and there aren't many decks in Modern that force you to do that. A lot of decks allow you to run autopilot. This deck is definitely not autopilot, so keep that in mind if you want to play Temur Hooting Delver. This is not an autopilot deck. This requires you to put in repetition, it requires you to commit, and it requires you to have patience and ways to control your anger, because you will get angry many times, especially when you first start out and you're still not sure how the deck is supposed to play. That being said, take a look at my matches. I think I have like maybe 14 posted already, or I will have 14 soon posted already, and I have many more that I want to post up in the coming months. Take a look at all those matches with Temur Delver and see how I play. Listen to my commentary, because I try and share my thought process through each phase, through each turn, and hopefully those videos will help you understand a bit more on how to play the deck, and maybe you can pick it up. And you know, I'm looking forward to hearing what you think about it and how you would play the deck. Maybe you've been playing the deck longer than me, or as long as me, or maybe you're just as crazy about it as I am. So I would love to hear from you and your ideas. So I think that's a good way to close out this deck tech. Thanks a lot for sticking around. I know it was long, but this is a deck that requires a lot of unpacking. Stay tuned for more. Thanks. And if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If you enjoy my content, please subscribe, support the channel. I'd really appreciate it. Have a good one.